Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Hi. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I think we're ready to start this session, which is focusing on moving from crisis response to being climate ready, and focusing on strengthening food systems for fragile contexts. So this is a 1-hour session, and we look forward to getting very useful insights from our panelists and also hearing feedback from the people who are seated in the room. So why is this an important conversation to have today while we're here in COP30? We know that producers and entrepreneurs in food systems that contribute to the least to climate crisis are already living with these consequences every day. They are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis. And in such settings, in such fragile settings, when environmental and institutional fragility converge, from Somalia to Nigeria and Syria to Yemen, there's recurrent droughts and floods and economic shocks which are coinciding with instability. This undermines food production, nutrition, markets. And so this session really explores how food systems, spanning from production to processing and consumption, can become a powerful vehicle for climate adaptation and co-benefits, and really advancing the food security agenda, livelihoods, and also contributing to emissions reductions. And also seeing how this food system really can integrate with the humanitarian aid, and so that we can bring about lasting change. So, because for COP30, we are hoping to advance this conversation to inform the global goal on adaptation conversation, and also to examine how fragile and conflict-affected states can better be included in adaptation and climate financing frameworks and discussions, and also how climate finance pipelines can be enhanced to ensure that some money is being set aside for such fragile systems within the food systems work. And so really, at the end of the day, at the end of this conversation, we are hoping to call for a shift from reactive response to anticipatory action, and long-term resilience approaches are being implemented in these fragile settings. And of course, we are going to explore different financial instruments, such as blended and risk-sharing finance, that can de-risk climate-smart agri-food ventures and expand renewable energy access and empower women and youth-led enterprises in the food systems in these fragile systems. So today, to help us unpack this very detailed conversation, we have an distinguished panel of speakers who are going to assist us to address this question. And I'd like to invite the speakers to come to the podium so that we can start having this conversation. And I would like to start to invite Adisu Negash Melki. He is with the Environment and Climate Change Coordination Lead, Ministry of Agriculture in Ethiopia. Thank you. Please have a seat. Let's clap for him, please, as he settles in. So Mr. Adisu has widespread experience in understanding government of Ethiopia's key programs, sector policy priority and development strategies, and we are hoping to learn from his insights around how we can further this conversation. Also with us we have Alvin Munyasya. He's a regional advocacy specialist with Action Against Hunger. He's an experienced advocacy practitioner, successful background in implementing people-centered movements and working directly with communities at the grassroots level to advocate for sustainable solutions to address root causes of hunger. So welcome, Alvin. Thank you for being here. Also joining us on stage is Olga Petriniak. She is the Senior Director, Climate Resilience Director with Mercy Corps, an NGO organization that is working to support working in the context of adaptation, resilience, and food systems. And so she's a seasoned specialist, 20 plus years. Looking forward to hearing your insights around this issue. I would also like to invite to the stage Irene Ayo. She is a partnerships officer from Last Mile Climate. She is a gender activist, she's a mediator, she's a peace builder, and an environmental advocate. And we're looking forward to learning more from you, Irene, as well. And last but definitely not least, I'd like to also welcome Jehan Zeb Shoudari. He is the lead technical specialist environment, gender and social inclusion division in IFAD, and we're looking forward to learn around. He's responsible for ensuring that IFAD's climate finance target for core funding remains on track. So very useful in terms of helping us unpack the quality and quantity of finance for food systems and fragile ecosystems. So thank you for being here. And so just to get us started off, I would like to hear from you, Mr. Adisu, from the government of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is obviously severely affected by climate crisis, which drives cycles of humanitarian needs. I'm very curious to hear from you, what are the opportunities that the Ministry of Agriculture sees to move beyond these cycles and drive adaptation and low carbon growth through food systems transformations, and really what types of initiatives and investments would make this possible? Over to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Adisu Nagash. I am a lead for Environment and Climate Change Coordination as a Minister of Agriculture of Ethiopia, just to move beyond humanitarian crisis, cyclic humanitarian crisis in Horn of Africa, in particular, in Africa generally. We are just, it needs or it requires a strategic shift towards more resilience, sustainable and low carbon or low emission agricultural food production systems. Just as a government of Ethiopia, we are implementing these climate smart agriculture interventions in upland, mixed farming area and agro-pastoral and pastoral areas through just implementing integrated water resource management activities through improved seed management for fodder and crop production, as well as we are implementing climate smart livestock productions through improving livestock breed and the feeding system for livestock, and improving rangeland management to come up with desirable vegetation mix in the lowland area from herbaceous, shrubs and tree species for camel, goat, sheep and goat herd compositions. And we are also implementing a small-scale irrigation, especially solar energy-based small-scale irrigation in lowland area to produce crops and also fodders for livestock. As a government of Ethiopia, our newly Prime Minister also implement climate-smart irrigable wheat productions for this country. And also as a Ministry of Agriculture, we are implementing Yelema Turufat to unlock our livestock production capacities. We are in number one in Africa in terms of livestock populations, where the productivity is very low. Just to improve this, with 19 universities, we are starting community-based breeding programs, just to shift from this humanitarian crisis due to food insecurity to sustainable resilience and low carbon agricultural food production systems. We are also investing on market infrastructure. We are also enhancing animal health veterinary services for mixed farming area, as well as for pastoral area of Afar and the Somali region, Borana region and the South Omo region of Ethiopia. We have just 12 river basins. Out of these 12 river basins, the 9 river basins are perennial rivers. Now starting to just construct small dams for small scale irrigation as well. Thank you very much for your first question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Adisu, for really expounding on the different approaches that are working for Ethiopia. Obviously, a very good example of what can be done in such fragile ecosystems. Now, moving over to Alvin, I'll be given the context in which action against hunger works, we'd like to hear from you about the role of anticipatory action and locally led adaptation in food systems, transformation towards resilient and low carbon development.
Thank you, moderator. The Horn of Africa is facing the most unprecedented humanitarian needs, even as we are having this conversation that has been convened by MASICOP. So the issue around moving from crisis to response and strengthening our food systems is critical for the Horn of Africa. And as I stand on the Africa Common position that Africa is a continent of special needs and circumstances, Just the other day, we heard that the government of Somalia has declared a drought situation where 4.4 million people already are in a situation where they are going to face acute food insecurity, and about 450,000 children are going to face acute malnutrition. The issue of anticipatory action has been discussed, and especially this year from Addis, during the Africa Climate Summit, all the way to the Africa Food Systems Forum. And African governments have committed on policy in terms of setting down strategies, adaptation strategies, that would enable the African continent to build resilience of local communities, and especially small-scale farmers who live in rural areas. This population in Africa, about 60% of the population in Africa depends on rain-fed agriculture. So drought-resistant crops are key in terms of building resilience, and in also embracing new ways and innovative ways of agriculture in our farming methodologies, and ensuring that these methods are able to build resilience of local small-scale farmers. Access to climate science and climate information and blending that with indigenous knowledge is one of the strategies that we are pushing in terms of ensuring that these local farmers have the requisite information that would enable them to anticipate and prepare rather than responding because of the expense that is involved in responding to these catastrophes, as opposed to building the capacity to respond to these impacts of climate change. And as I finish, early warning is key because it strengthens resilience and it enables communities to come up with coping mechanisms of local communities. And we are also pushing for inclusivity of women, young people, and indigenous people to be part of decision-making processes for early preparedness in governance system.
Thank you very much, Alvin, for reminding us, the importance of, the early warning and really how anticipatory action plays out in such settings. I would like now to move over to Olga, who works with Mexico, and of course Mexico works in a range of climate and conflict affected settings where a range of fragility factors intersect. So tell us about how you're supporting food systems transformation in this context, and what are you learning about what works and what doesn't work?
Yeah, thanks, Nelly. As you pointed out, our organization works in some of the contexts where people currently are most hit by the climate crisis. It's not an abstract concept to them. They feel its effects every day, and yet they're least responsible for it. But to come to food systems specifically as a vehicle for resilience and kind of longer-term transformation, I kind of want to paint a picture of the food system context in Africa first, which is currently the focus of my work, where essentially the food system is built on the backbone of smallholder farmers. So there's 33 million smallholder farms that take up basically are 80% of the total farms, and they provide 70% of Africa's food supply. And yet, Africa is also the one continent that was mentioned in the latest report on the state of food security and nutrition, is the one where all the indicators on food security and nutrition are headed in the wrong direction. So things are getting worse. And often it is these smallholder farmers that feed the continent. It is the various businesses and actors along the supply chain that deliver food to people that are most affected and that require humanitarian assistance frequently in order to meet their food needs and to make ends meet. And of course, climate change is a big culprit in that regard in terms of reducing productivity, decimating yields, et cetera. But I think there are other factors that we have to acknowledge that make currently make the food system in Africa not be able to respond to these climate shocks and make things worse. And these are a number of different pressure, including thin markets, subsidies that reward industrial production over smallholder farms, weak land tenure systems, financing that's not necessarily structured to reach the last mile farmer, but to reach bigger corporations. And so what happens is these farmers, rather than becoming part of economically viable models that can help them adapt, in fact become reliant on year humanitarian assistance that perpetuates cycles of need. And it's sometimes when it stays too long, it can actually deplete business opportunities, right? Because I'm not going to have a seed business if you're constantly getting free seeds, for example. And so I just want to share sort of examples of alternative models that have worked in these contexts from a couple of different places that I think serve as lessons for how we can work differently. One context is Northeast Nigeria, where Mercy Corps began working shortly after the Boko Haram insurgency years ago. This was a place that was immediately a recipient of a lot of cash assistance, which was really important for people to meet immediate needs. But there were also real business opportunities for people in that economy that were not being invested in. Mercy Corps worked with literally tens of thousands of farmers in indigenous food systems and millet and cowpea. First, working on how do you improve productivity by building a more climate resilient seed system. So connecting local seed suppliers, indigenous seed producers, research institutions, and even upstream seed processors to build a more viable seed system, reliable seed system for farmers that was commercially driven. Second, working not just with production, but also developing an innovation fund that allowed for kind of a boom of small and medium enterprises in food packaging, processing, biofortification, distribution, that, for example, allowed cowpea to be milled into flour that could then be sold in sachets that were more affordable to the local population. But we also created upstream links to businesses like Calico Foods that then also were able to kind of create a whole value chain in this ecosystem. I was actually on a panel in Northeast Nigeria with execs from, Premier Seeds that said, we never thought there was a market here in Maiduguri. And yet now we have massive investments in processing that are reaching kind of last mile communities. My colleague from the Ministry of Agriculture in Ethiopia spoke to, the food systems in Ethiopia. And I think likewise, we see huge opportunities in the livestock sector and pastoralism, which I think you often frequently hear about the number of animals who've been killed as a result of the last drought, the kind of ongoing decimation of that livelihood system. Sometimes there's questions around whether it's even viable anymore. I mean, we're talking about an economy that contributes up to, beyond a quarter, up to a third of agricultural GDP for some of these countries, all built on the backbone of rangelands and livestock and pastoral economies. So again, here we work with upstream livestock aggregators, bought down their risk to aggregate livestock from women's groups, in last mile communities, kind of cutting out middlemen and creating a direct link and access to that market. We also work with dozens of private veterinary pharmacies, with feed and fodder suppliers, to look at how they can structure their business models to provide viable services to pastoralists in the last mile, so they could access these products that they need to adapt with consistency and with quality, that they're not just NGO supported and they're dependent on donor aid, but actually building a viable local economy. So I just want to close by saying that I think there is a lot of hope. It requires a reframe in mindset. And yes, humanitarian assistance will always, be important, but we have to look at how to deliver that in a way that doesn't undermine the economic viability of food systems in these areas.
Thank you very much, Olga, for painting such a good picture of how food systems in Africa look like, and more importantly, giving us tangible experiences of where alternative successful models have worked, and of course, with a ray of hope in terms of what is needed in terms of reframing minds. Thank you for that. So Irene, I want to shift over to you. And of course, you work at the intersection of gender activism, mediation, peace building, environmental conservation, and also promoting solar energy. What is needed to bring about food systems transformational change with this context, given your background?
Thank you so much, moderator. You did mention that I'm also a refugee.
Oh, yes, very important. Thank you
Yes.
very much.
I'm also a refugee in Uganda, and I want to bring my experience from being a refugee, how growing up in a refugee camp. When I was young, I didn't know that I was actually a refugee because I was living in a peaceful environment. Every day, my father wakes me up and says, let's go to the garden, carry hoe, let's go and, dig. So we were growing our own food. I could hardly see UNHCR cars, World Food Program cars. There were no partners in Kiriandongo in late 90s. And then I was wondering whether I'm in a refugee camp. And then in 2003, when the camp in Acholpi was attacked, that is the time UNHCR brought refugees, South Sudanese refugees who were in Acholpi to our settlement. And then I started seeing people lining up for food. Some people are being called refugees. I said, okay, so am I also a refugee? My father said, yes, you are. I said, but why we don't receive food? That because we are not in a camp. We're in a settlement. We have access to land. We grow our own food. And so I didn't experience lining up for food until 2014, when the second wave of conflicts happened in South Sudan. And then so many people came in, relatives, and then UNHCR decided to take all of us back to food ration, so all of us could go. And my experience is not good because what I have witnessed in the settlement, I've witnessed people stepping on a mother, a pregnant mother, because they are rushing to receive food on the line, and she died. And that was the last time I went to receive food. It's not a good experience. And if you calculate the process of bringing this food, there's a lot of expenses. And so that is how people see us refugees. But I'm happy to discuss this today, and also I would like to tell you that refugee communities are not aid recipients. We have got a lot of other potentials. That is the knowledge, the network, and a deeply motivation to build resilience. And so in many refugee settlements in Uganda, farmers face challenges because in Uganda we are given land. And then this land, of course, that is where we grow our food. Now we have been categorized in different groups. My family are in group 3. So group 3, you're not qualified to get food, but to grow your own food. But there are times that you can't harvest anything because of prolonged drought. Like last year, really, we couldn't harvest anything. So this is an opportunity for renewable energy because refugee farmers lacked good storage for their crops. They lack unreliable rainfall. They lack processing tools, modern processing tools. And so when you see all these problems, renewable energy can easily address them. One, renewable energy can support farmers to engage in irrigation farming, where a refugee woman can grow food throughout the year. So you don't have dry season, rainy season. Doesn't mean you have your food that you grow throughout the year. And also putting in mind that, I don't know in other countries, but in Uganda, 80% of the 2 million refugees are women and children. And so these women get some income through cultivation to send their children to school. So if a woman uses irrigation system, which is solar powered, that means she has no bill to pay, but she has income coming in to support her children to go to school. Not only that, but also energy access for water system, both for household consumption and agricultural products, you know. And then the last thing, we've been talking about income here. For a refugee woman, if I sell maize a kilo at 500, okay, and then Alvin goes to the market and buys kaunga, maize flour at 1,500 a kilo because of the value addition. And so this is what we should be thinking, because dryers, millers, good storage system can help solve this problem. You know, if I have a miller, I was part of the Gogla last year in Kenya, where I saw solar-powered millers that you don't need energy. If you give to a woman, even in her house, she can just pour maize there, milled, and then do the packaging and take to the market. She will earn more than what she gets when she sells in terms of maize. So really, these are realities on the ground, and these are opportunities for renewable energy. So through the Solco partnership that Masiko leads in Uganda, we support energy access for cooking, but also for production use. Irrigation, PAMAP, through Sustain that Masiko is leading in Uganda, in Bidi, there are households that have now purchased the solar-powered irrigation system, and they are growing food, vegetables, you know, throughout the year. And these are things that we are seeing. What if Sustain is scaled to other settlements? That means every single refugee woman in Uganda will be able to grow food without depending on aid. And I think Sustain and Solco is coming at the right time when there's no what we call grants or aid, okay? So now we need to depend on ourselves. So we need to be very creative, but also bring private sector on board, because they're the ones that have these technologies. Thank you so much.
Wow. I'm lost for words, Irene, but really, thank you for that raw experience of your experience as a refugee, and definitely a true story of what transformation looks like in these settings. But thank you for sharing those experiences. Now I'd like to shift gears to IFAD, Yahan, just to really understand how is IFAD approaching its investments in fragile conflict-affected landscapes, and what is key to unlocking transformational change to move beyond humanitarian crises and towards long-term climate adaptation, resilience, and low-carbon development. Over to you.
I failed my first IQ test. I am very bored of hearing myself, but your story was super inspiring. Thank you very much for sharing. It has energized me. You asked me two sub-questions, what we are doing and what could potentially unlock more financing. I'll try to respond with one single answer with three messages. The first one is it's important to think about insurance as an instrument. We talk a lot about climate finance. We talk about increasing the flow we don't necessarily talk a lot about increasing the quality of climate finance. I think the quality is important, especially when it comes to predictability of climate financing, the intended use of climate finance, and the impact it is generating on the ground. Keeping this point aside, going back to the insurance story, we are investing in a project in 7 Sahel countries. As you know, that the context is very fragile in these countries, and it's a project with GCF whereby we are trying to do 3 things. The first is about anticipation. What could be the anticipated risk, and what are the actions you can take in order to ensure that information is reaching the small-scale farmers. Weather information system is a classic example. So first one is all about anticipation. The second is you may anticipate and the risk may occur. The question is, how do you reduce that risk? And that's where things like climate resilient seeds come in. Climate is changing, seeds need to adapt, distribution of climate seeds to the small-scale farmers that are resilient, the climate seeds that are resilient. So that's kind of a step 2. Step 3, you may take all of these actions, but there will still be some residual risk. What do you do with that risk? And the answer is you pool the multi-hazard risk, and then you transfer this risk to the insurance industry. So with the investment coming from GCF, from us, this is what we are doing in 7 Sahel countries. I think the key message here is it's not just the insurance. What we are trying to do is bundle this insurance with microfinance. So the small-scale farmers on one hand can get the microfinance, but the other hand, in order for them to secure the future, can buy this insurance at a subsidized rate. And the subsidization is coming from the grant element of GCF financing. So that bundling of instrument, particularly in fragile context, is very important. So that's message number 1. Message number 2 is, and I wanted to give an example, in Nigeria, we are implementing a project with approximately $85 million investment. Out of that, $25 million is focused on agribusiness development. So this is about entrepreneurship, but it is also about mentorship. So how we can deploy mentors for young agri-entrepreneurs. And so we have created 25,000 agribusiness with an investment of $85 million US. But what we have realized, if you have just a single focused approach on agribusiness and entrepreneurship and do not focus on infrastructure building and market access, then this doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's not going to lead to increased income because they do not necessarily have a marketplace where they can sell their produce or sell their products or sell their services. But you can at the same time have those market infrastructure, but if you don't have the roads, the feeder roads, for example, then it's very difficult for them to access, and the opportunity cost is very high, and the input cost becomes very high. So again, this time it's about bundling the areas. It's not only just the bundling the financial instruments, but how you can bundle various different interventions together in order for you to have an impact. And the third one is all about sending the signal. We all want the private sector to get involved. We all know that we don't have sufficient public financing in order to tackle the challenges that we are facing in fragile context or any context. But are we giving the right market signal? And even if you are giving the right market signal, are we deploying those risk mitigation instruments? So I'm going to give you an example of another project that we are implementing, not necessarily fragile context, but you can replicate this model in fragile context. So we have created a stacked financing system whereby we have the first loss facility. In the first loss facility, we have approximately 45 million US dollars, and this is grant money coming from GCF and coming from some Nordic donors. It's just purely grant financing. Then in the second layer, the subordinated loan, IFAD is deploying the concessional financing together with GCF. Concessional loan is going in the second stack. And the benefit of these two stacks is, at the seniors level, at the third stack, we have managed to get $90 million investment from Equity Bank, which is purely a commercial bank. Why do you think that they're investing $90 million? Because their risk is being reduced through that first loss facility. So it's not that the private sector doesn't have the money or that they don't have the interest, but we need to create that enabling environment for them to come in. But it is not only the financing angle that we are talking about. Equity Bank is going to be investing for the first time on adaptation financing that they haven't done. We all say, adaptation financing, it doesn't have an investment case. It does have an investment case. And we don't have to see adaptation and mitigation in isolation. Adaptation financing can have mitigation benefits. If you have agroforestry, it has mitigation benefits, all the carbon credit that you can generate and sell in the marketplace. So let's also look towards the market. What are those market instruments that are out there? So it's important for us to send those market signals by creating that enabling environment. So again, I think the three messages is about bundling of financial instruments. The second is about bundling of interventions. And third is, let's send the right market signal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yehan, for that comprehensive intervention. And so I think I'd like to shift gears a bit now, because we've had experiences from government, from people who are actually implementing programs on the ground, people who are from these settings as well, and donors. I'd like us now to dig into enabling factors. So looking forward to explore what type of transformational investments are needed within this context to ensure that there is lasting change. And so we're looking at what is really needed to make transformational change around financing, around policy action, as well as partnerships. And I'd like to start with Alvin, because I know you have to leave shortly. But really, Action Against Hunger just recently published a paper highlighting what is needed to foster a just rural transition in fragile and conflict-affected settings. Please tell us what you see as key enabling factors from this COP30 that is needed to drive systemic change.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier this year, and Jahan has just unpacked it very well. We, in the African continent, before I come back to what SCF published, the conversation started in Malabo, and earlier this year, the Kampala Declaration of African member states has pronounced itself on behalf of the continent. And as civil society organizations, we have a group of CADEP non-state actors, I see one here, whom have been pushing for the quality of climate finance. And whatever that means is the reason as to why we are also here at COP30 to push for adaptation financing, one that would trickle down to small-scale farmers and rural communities, and to those that need it, and especially those that are on the front line of conflict and hunger. Having said that, the nationally determined contributions are the vehicle in which this climate finance would reflect to ensure that it trickles down to those that need it. And therefore, within the CADE policy framework or the new 10-year strategy, the 10% public investment should be one that would unlock private sector investment. So it is important that this COP30 must initiate a just transition in agriculture, food system, that is also in line with the aspirations of the African continent, which is the Africa Common Position, but also one that would scale up public support for agroecological and climate resilient food systems that puts people at the center of all these climate solutions that we are proposing. Number two, on the global goal on adaptation, I am thrilled that you can say there are resources for adaptation, but your parties, we've just heard from the corridors what is happening within the negotiations at ministerial level, it is at political level. We hope that this COP30 will conclude with a fit-for-purpose indicators that will focus on the means of implementation, because the means of implementation is what will unlock the resources across all the climate finance that is needed for those communities that are there, that are already facing the brunt of climate change, for them to be able to respond to the catastrophes of climate change. And for me, it is a moral responsibility pegged and anchored on the Paris Agreement, on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities. So for me, again, pushing for Africa's food systems, it needs bold leadership where we can move from vision to action in global solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alvin. And now I'd like to move over to Mr. Adisu, just really to also get your perspective from Ethiopia. What enabling factors have worked to get your priorities off the ground in Ethiopia? And what shifts are needed within both the global and national policies and commitment to move beyond funding just crises and really moving into climate resilience and long-term development through food systems?
Okay, thank you very much again. And these climate change issues are beyond the political boundary, so it needs coordinated efforts of different governments. I think just luring private sectors toward climate action is very important thing. As a government of Ethiopia, Ministry of Agriculture, in collaboration with Alliance Biodiversity and the SEAT, we are just developing climate smart agriculture investment plan, just to show as a business case for private sectors to lure private sectors towards climate actions. As well as we develop 6 concept notes this year for GCF, and we upload UNFCCC portals. This portal is launched last year at Baku COP under Sharm el-Sheikh joint work on implementation of climate actions in agriculture and food security. So any parties, any development partners also able to just upload different concept notes on this portal under UNFCCC. So this also creates just luring private sectors and luring any development partners to fund this concept notes. And also as a Ministry of Agriculture, we just change our policies, agriculture and rural development policies. We incorporated climate change and environmental safeguard issues on our policy documents, and we also establish National Climate Smart Agriculture Forum, which university and research organizations, development organizations, CSO, private sectors are a member to just create collaboration, partnership, and exchange of ideas, and to know who just implement, who are successful, who are not, and to exchange and creating collaborations. Not only finance, just climate change pose negative impacts. Climate change also offers opportunities of collaboration and partnership. So with this forum, we are just able to just create somewhat a collaboration and a partnership, and also we lure some climate finances toward the end. Our government also sets from regular annual budget. Just our government also just sets 0.5 to 1% of our annual budget for land restoration activities. Yeah, just depends upon WRI studies. 54,000 hectares of our lands are at different level of degradations. So just to rehabilitate this, our government also locally funds 0.5 to 1% of government budgets annually. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adisu, for those useful insights. And so I'd like now to move to Olga. You mentioned that market-based investments as being key, and there has been a lot of discussion really on how private sector investment and loan mechanisms can support adaptation and rural transitions. What is your message around the type and quantity of climate finance that is needed that can ensure food systems transformation really enables climate readiness and resilient climate action?
Thanks, Nelly, and the rain is really working against us, isn't it? And I think my other colleagues have covered some of this, but maybe I'll start from a slightly different angle, is to just say that while we know there's not enough climate finance going to these spaces, there is a lot of ODA in general and a lot of humanitarian dollars, and we know that communities don't really care how we label the pots of money coming into them. They just want to know that they can use that money to meet their aspirations, their goals, to adapt. And so I guess I'll start with a message on the humanitarian side of things, that a lot of that finance can be deployed in a more forward-thinking, resilience-oriented manner. I think for us that means three different things. One is market-based approaches that I mentioned, but even when it comes to anticipatory action, I mean, just for example, in the last kind of 2.5-year drought in the Horn, we were able to leverage traders to offtake livestock from communities that would have otherwise died. For $100,000, we leveraged $1 million from the private sector to be able to buy those animals for a good enough price where households could invest that cash to protect their breeding stock, to protect their milking herds, but would sell animals that would have otherwise died. I would say, and what that allowed things to do is to keep the markets going and to strengthen market connections rather than having those collapse during a humanitarian emergency. I would also say that in order for things like that to work, you need to act early, and I think my colleague Alvin spoke about the need to invest humanitarian funding in terms of anticipatory action. And I think the third thing I would say around that is around integration. We have numerous studies that point to the fact that when you're able to build multiple sources of resilience, so early warning information and including market access, including financial services, that those sources of resilience translate into improved food security during crisis, as opposed to having just kind of one action work on its own. Now I want to come to climate finance. I mean, I don't think I can articulate it better than Jahan did, but I will just say, on the one hand, we know there's not enough climate finance. I think only 10% flows to fragile places. I think only 4% to food systems, which I still struggle with as a statistic. Apparently 1% to smallholder farmers. But I think one of the things, we've also recently conducted a study that demonstrated that only about 3% of private sector finance is leveraged towards adaptation, where that figure could be up to 15%. And so if we structure the right kind of de-risking instrument, the right kind of layered financing, we can have a bigger share of private sector and bigger blended finance mechanisms invest in fragile places. But the final point I want to make is that does take grant and concessional funding, right? You're not going to get the $90 million from Equity Bank unless you have all those other layers. So private sector is not kind of the silver bullet. It needs to come along with the right other kind of instruments to make those pieces work. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Olga. And now I'd like to move over to Irene, and really I'd love to hear from you around what you see as the key enabling factors from this COP30 to really drive systemic change around food systems.
Thank you, moderator, again for this second question. See, climate change in a refugee context, it is survival, protection, and dignity. So when we are talking about climate change solutions in our context, that's how we understand it. And from this COP, what I'm hoping for is to see how many countries will include refugees in their NDCs and NAPs. Because then when you leave the displaced population out of your NAPs and NDC, you're technically knocking them out from accessing the finance. And when you look at the total population of the refugees in the world, it's over 100+ million people. And this is a big number. If we are to be a country, it can even be, third or fourth, the most populated country in the world. So integrating refugees in the national policies, it's very key in terms of accessing financing. In Uganda, before, land was given to you as much as you want, but now it is 30 by 30. Really, this is very small. And what we are requesting the government to do is to really include refugees on national policies that governs land, to allow refugee farmers to access land, use it, and then when times come, they give the land back to the government when times come to repatriate. These are things we are really looking at, but I don't want to leave this stage without speaking about the important role that private sector can play. Johan has mentioned a lot, and I don't think I can speak more than already what he has said. But private sector has got a lot of potential to support the refugee community. Through the Solco partnership, we bring different players together. The refugee-led organization that create market for the products. And then we bring the private sector that bring the products, the appliances, the solar and water view, and then we have the microfinance institutions that brings on board the financing. And now we are mapping out different interest rates, and we see which one really fits in a refugee context. There's potential for investment in displacement settings, and this is what we are trying to unlock. But we also have the government on board to ensure that we have this enabling environment. We have the necessary policies that really support this kind of partnership. And truly, to scale up all these solutions, we need policy integration in place, and we need strong partnership with the private sector. And so my hope for COP and beyond is that investors realize the opportunity in the refugee context, that there's huge opportunity to invest in the refugee setting. In Uganda, we have learned that it is refugees that have better saving culture than the nationals, because the rate of default among refugee community, it is 0.1%. So this is a huge opportunity for the private sector. And if you're a private sector in the room, please let's work together. Come and invest and trust refugees with your fund, because then you're investing in the right place. Thank you. Over to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Irene. And I think it's just perfect setting. Yahan, I think you heard she's saying, invest in refugees, no pressure. I'm looking at IFAD. But really, I'd love to hear from you around what IFAD is seeing as core to ensuring both the quantity and quality of climate finance and other development financing, support food systems that better serve communities in places like Nigeria and Ethiopia. And she gave us very good examples from Uganda. So, yeah, I'd love to hear from you about that.
All right, very quickly. Again, three things, three reforms that we are looking into. One is we keep on hearing about food systems, right? But what is this food system? In the food system space, whether you're thinking about fragile context or non-fragile context, you have water, you have energy, you have agriculture, you have infrastructure, Now, think about all the ministries that are involved. Water ministry, they want to increase the supply of water. Agriculture ministry, they want to increase the yield. You have energy ministry that wants to increase the electrification. You have finance ministry that is looking for growth opportunities so they can generate the revenue that the country needs. So many different mandates. These are not mandates that can converge very easily. Yeah, sometimes there are conflicting mandates, competing mandates. Now we are talking about NDCs, yeah? For climate, we are talking about NAPs. We are talking about biodiversity action plans, so many different plans. I think it's very difficult for a country, especially if you're in a fragile situation, to ensure that all these plans are converging, and then you can reflect them in the national development plans, and then you can reflect them in the national budget, and then you can reflect them in the district development plans. It's just too complex. We really need to reduce this complexity, especially in contexts where the capacity is very, very low. I mean, even the developed countries will have struggle to adjust all of these plans. So that's one. The second is we always think about private sector, but these are private sector that are coming from abroad. Not necessarily. There's a lot of private sector players that are involved in the entire value chain. You have the seed suppliers, you have the processors, you have the packagers, you have the transporters, you have the energy suppliers. We counted how much did we actually mobilize from the private sector across the value chain from A to the last point. It's 1.5 billion US dollars mobilized from the local private sector entities. So the private sector entities do not always have to be the foreign commercial banks, asset managers, insurance companies. They can be locals. And let's not forget about the public development banks. Their balance sheet, in many cases, are bigger than some of the multilateral development banks. Yeah? So let's also use them as intermediary, because it's going to be very difficult for us to reach every single small-scale farmer. So the more aggregation we can ensure, the more efficiency we can gain into the system. And my last point is change of narrative. And this is something we have been saying throughout this COP. We really need to think about changing the narrative from a very doom and gloom scenario whereby we are talking about financing gap, we are talking about climate shocks, we are talking about threats, to more of an investment opportunity. Yeah? That there is, if you think about food system as a whole, that there is $10 trillion investment opportunity. And if that is the case, whether you're talking about conflict context or non-conflict context, what is the NPV? What is the benefit to cost ratio? What is the internal rate of return? Let's come up with these numbers in order to attract the finance ministry, but at the same time, the private sector. I've been saying this for, I think, for 11 years. 11 years now, my 11th COP. The day I see that we have more representation from finance ministry in a COP is the day I would qualify a COP as a very, very successful COP. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yehan, for those thought-provoking sentiments. I see that we now have 3 minutes to the end of our session. But before I give up my wrap-up, I'd just like to turn the floor back to you in case there's anyone in the room who would like to contribute to this conversation or to seek clarification. But I see that there's no need for that. So really, this has been a very good conversation. I'm very, very encouraged coming from this conversation, and I hope that you are. We've had, a lot of insights around just starting from what Yahan really giving us a challenge to change the narrative. That these settings are it's not all doom and gloom, that there is opportunity. We also had from Irene very raw experiences, and she also challenged us to invest in such settings, and that there's willingness to pay. I think you mentioned a number around the default numbers are very low, 0.4 in these settings. So that is a good number. That's a good statistic for anyone who's willing to invest in such areas. And very good examples from Ethiopia we've had around what they're really doing, tangible experiences and programs and adaptation interventions that are being implemented in these areas. And of course from Olga, very useful insights around actual examples of what is happening. You painted a very good picture about what food systems in Africa look like. And of course, you gave us a challenge around what market systems could do to improve this situation. So really thank you everyone from the panel for your insightful thoughts on this issue. And hopefully we see most of these conversations, informing the COP conversation that is going on. So thank you again. Another round of applause. Thank you.